Thank you very much indeed for your kind introduction, Nasser. And first of all, my sincere thanks to Michaela Broadbent, who's here, and Professor Nasser Nier and of course the University of Glasgow for inviting me and indeed hosting me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. And thank you all so much for coming along and indeed for allowing me to talk about my new book, Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic. We will be discussing it in the context of the overall theme of identity, and so it's wonderful to come and talk about it in this great city and indeed in this magnificent and very ancient university. Glasgow has, of course, a strong identity. It means so much to so many people all over the world, whether discussing politics, music, sport, science, theatre, and crucially, what it means to be Scottish. But Glaswegians stand out for all kinds of reasons, from their accents and their manners to the football teams they support. And it's by no means just a Scottish identity. It really is a very specifically Glaswegian one. The Old Alliance against England was crucial once to this sense of identity. And today I'll be mainly talking about the second party in this historic union, which was of course France. The great thing about speaking about France in Scotland is that the Old Alliance remains extremely strong, and as General Charles de Gaulle himself put it in 1942, I quote, "I don't think that the Frenchman can ever come to Scotland without feeling sensitive to the special emotion, the awareness of 1,000 ties still living and cherished at the heart of the Franco-Scottish alliance, the oldest alliance in the world." Well, I can tell you that the French view the Scottish as being extremely sophisticated and indeed cultured, unlike that money-obsessed nation of shopkeepers down the road. And both the Scottish and the French believe in great ideas. Hence, Glasgow University playing such a big part in the Scottish Enlightenment during the 18th century. So I hope that we can follow in their tradition today and have a really interesting discussion in the Rousseau and indeed Hume tradition. Identity is a theme that runs throughout my book, and I've tried hard to establish what being French means in 2024. And I set this investigation with a book that is as much a guide to modern France as it is a critique. France is a country that seems to have it all, yet its citizens are angry and dissatisfied. Why? Well, in the past year alone, I've witnessed intense rioting there, interviewed some of the most bigoted extremists you're likely to find anywhere in Europe, and heard thousands of people calling for the destruction of the entire constitutional system, a system that currently holds France together. And dare I say, holds France back. The world is changing rapidly, France isn't really changing with it, and extreme dissent in a country already known for very extreme dissent is the result. France is undergoing an identity crisis, and my book highlights failures that are both inherited and new, while also trying to solve them. And this is the main reason I was determined to write this book now. This France in turmoil and these extremely dramatic developments are what my book is all about. I've divided the book into a number of straightforward themes, 10 chapters ranging from politics, social policy, and economics to feminism, identity, education, terrorism, protest, foreign policy, and the far right, as exemplified by the dynastic party of Marine Le Pen. important factor in my analysis is that my background is in Algeria, once the jewel in the crown of the French Empire. But unlike similar imperial jewels, such as British India, Algeria was considered to be part of mainland France. It had its own MPs in the Paris National Assembly, French town halls, and more than 1 million so-called pieds noirs settlers from Europe. Algeria won independence from France in 1962, following a horrendously destructive 8-year war that took place both in North Africa and on mainland France. The conflict directly led to the creation of the Fifth Republic as an all-powerful president, an alpha male, it's always been a male so far, and an equally strong security state were set up to deal with insurgent Algerian nationalists. Tensions between France and its Algerians continue to this day, not least on the estates where many from Algerian backgrounds remain dominant. The legacy of this cataclysmic conflict still has an enormous influence on modern France. And there is lots of commentary in my book, and indeed an attempt to provide a new and original view of what the modern French Republic is all about. The book doesn't shy away from very difficult issues, and I think that's important. It also acknowledges how massively popular France is for very good reasons. And in this sense, Fixing France explores a mythical country built on the highest ideals possible. If we look beyond the massive bloodshed of successful and indeed successive revolutions, France is frequently portrayed as a charming picture postcard land full of delightful conformists. There is no doubt whatsoever that France remains a glamorous country, at least in the popular imagination. It is associated with great art, fashion, romance, food, and 1,000 other things that make life so enjoyable. And that's why it's the most popular tourist destination in the world, and why so many people dream of living there. We can, of course, add intellectual rigor and a great deal of philosophy to the mix. France is certainly overwhelmed by idealism, and that's the phrase I use in the book. And this naturally appeals to millions of people around the world who are looking for the perfect mode de vie, the perfect way of life. So, yes, a very important argument in my book is that France is built on impossible idealism, born out of revolutions, and this is why myths are so important to holding it together. The truth, however, is that France is a country made up of very beautiful myths. It is a perpetual illusion, to quote the wartime hero and architect of the Fifth Republic, General Charles de Gaulle. And so it's easy to get lost in that romanticism while missing the real story. And what my book does is cut through some of the mythologies and illusions so as to present a more rounded picture of a nation that's really struggling. It is a country of impossibly high ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity for all, that France fails to uphold in real life. And my book is precisely about the gulf between France myth on the one hand and France reality on the other hand. And they are certainly very different. The myth is a glorious republic built on those high ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity for all. It is the birthplace of human rights and a country where everybody is technically treated exactly the same as a valued citizen. The reality is a thoroughly uneven country where billionaire industrialists are supported by a complacent Paris establishment, all broadly support the status quo because they do very well out of it. Reform is incredibly difficult because the very dated Fifth Republic Constitution doesn't allow it. Thus, France doesn't adapt to the modern world, that is to say, a world where communities are changing rapidly, and where new technology and better communications are rapidly altering the nature of the world in which we live. And in some ways, we're going through another enlightenment, with better communication and far more information exposing the fault lines. So, in principle, the constitution of the current Fifth Republic is meant to achieve those ideals for all. In practice, however, it delivers on those ideals only for some. For those with the right background, the right education, the right gender, and indeed the right connections. And this is the great contradiction at the heart of the French Republic that stems from its very constitution. Let me outline more specifically some of the fault lines that I examine in my book. My book describes how a Paris elite still benefits most from the trappings of power and indeed the riches of modern capitalism, while millions of citizens struggle despite France's much vaunted egalitarian motto. Yes, there are plenty of civil service jobs. Public spending currently represents 59% of GDP, but pay is as low as morale in this vast, unmotivated workforce. State debt exceeds 3 trillion euros, and economists believe that the current system is unsustainable. And that's why millions of French citizens regularly take to the streets to express their anger. There were 2 massive riot seasons last year. One to oppose pension reforms that President Macron pushed through without parliamentary approval, and this was a prime example of how undemocratic the French political system is. The other to express outrage at the shooting dead of an ethnic minority teenager by a policeman, an agent of the state. 17-year-old Nahel Merzouk was French, of Algerian and Moroccan background. And in that sense, the Fifth Republic's firm roots in the Algerian War still influence the way people like Nahel and myself are treated today. We were originally classed as Arab Muslims from Algeria and not French citizens. Extensive security was used to subdue us. For example, state of emergency legislation allowed curfews on the estates, and these measures are still regularly used today. On the most basic level, there is no doubt that an Algerian name and indeed appearance holds you back in a country where we're still treated with immense suspicion. And that also goes for African and North African names and appearances in particular. Nahel's killing led to more than a week of rioting. But the really violent rioting doesn't just come from ethnic minorities. The biggest protest movement in recent years were the Gilets jaunes, the so-called yellow vests, who are mainly white working class agitators. They brought cities such as Paris to a standstill, Saturday after Saturday, while causing millions of pounds worth of damage. These were classic French riots, institutionalised riots that have been a continual feature of both Macron's terms of office. So people from different communities, whether in rural France or neglected housing estates, do not feel a sense of fraternity, unfortunately. My book analyses fault lines through multiple subjects, but perhaps the best way to illustrate this broken republic is through politics, because it is the whole presidential system that renders France broken. France's constitutional setup leads to an absurd reliance on one individual with far too much influence over every aspect of national life. Far too much power is centralized in the head of state, who can act like a quasi-monarch and hijack the whole system by ruling by decree and overriding parliament, choosing his prime minister, and appointing anyone he likes to form a government, whether close friends or corporate cronies. They don't even have to be elected politicians, not even the prime minister. The French president doesn't need a coalition to govern either. The head of state also has his finger on the nuclear button. In other words, this is the very definition of an elective dictatorship. The truth is, the current Fifth Republic is a makeshift measure created by General Charles de Gaulle in 1958 to impose military rule during the Algerian War of Independence. And it is therefore an outdated presidential system that points to a yawning democratic deficit, and checks and balances are needed to put an end to this elective dictatorship. I think that the prospect of a far-right president is certainly one of the biggest crises in the Fifth Republic. Marine Le Pen, of the Rassemblement National, or the National Rally, has gone runner-up to Emmanuel Macron in the last two presidential elections. He cannot stand in 3 years' time, only 2 terms are allowed constitutionally, and Le Pen is currently leading opinion polls as a likely successor. This is despite Le Pen being one of only 89 National Rally-linked members of parliament, a relatively small number out of 577 MPs, but a power base in the National Assembly is by no means a prerequisite for ultimate power in France, and instead a determined individual can play the system. Now, millions thought it was outrageous of Macron to push up the retirement age from 62 to 64 without the parliamentary approval. But imagine what Marine Le Pen will get up to if she's in charge. She too can rule by decree while filling up a government with unelected politicians and pass the most bigoted policies or worse. And if you look at the history, the National Rally, formerly known as the Front National, the National Front, they are a terrifying party. As I make clear in my book, they represent a party with direct roots to the Nazis. The National Rally was founded as the National Front in 1972 by Marine Le Pen's father, the now convicted racist and Holocaust denier Jean-Marie Le Pen. Those who made up the original National Front Leadership Committee included men who had fought in the Waffen-SS during the Second World War and thus swore an oath to Adolf Hitler, or else served with French paramilitary police units, the milices, that collaborated with the Third Reich. Marine Le Pen claims to have softened and diversified the party. She even tried to recruit me when I met her. But Nazi nostalgia remains strong among some of its rank and file. and so there's vicious prejudice against Arabs and Muslims, not least because of the bitter resentment over the loss of France's colonial empire in Africa and North Africa, and especially Algeria in the 1960s. And Le Pen still regularly complains that, and I quote, immigrants turn France into a gigantic squat, and that entire neighborhoods are taken over by foreigners. As Macron's administration now moves further to the right, so as to face up to the Le Pen challenge, and Macron's policies from law and order to immigration have become far more reactionary, Macron even appears to be appeasing French conspiracy theorists who believe that the indigenous population is reproducing so slowly that it will one day be overtaken by large families linked to Africa and North Africa, and thus threaten white European identity. Now, this so-called Great Replacement theory is as hyperbolic as it is deeply racist, but it is routinely rehearsed by the kind of far-right radicals that Macron is trying to appeal to. I met Éric Zemmour, the shock jock right-winger who stood for president against Macron in 2022, and he was openly rehearsing Great Replacement theory, even to me. And there is no better illustration of how far-right discourse has become mainstream in France, of how it has become normalized. But this isn't just simply a problem with the far-right. The entire system is riddled with discrimination and indeed prejudice. And as far as the more specific theme of identity is concerned, the idea is that French citizens are united within a law-abiding republic where shared ideals override any other loyalties, whether related to culture, race, religion, or indeed anything else. Officially, the common denominator is this very distinct form of republican unity, one that implies that everybody shares the same values. And the French model is unique in that it asks immigrants to leave all their cultural inheritance at the point of entry. Everybody is meant to be molded into an identikit citizen. Descendants of immigrants are also purged of their ancestry. This establishment position originates from Enlightenment philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose thinking helped bring about the overthrow of the French crown in 1789. However, there is certainly a disconnect between many French citizens and the country they should technically identify. And by far, the ugliest form of discrimination in France, and indeed within French society, is one built on racism and on race. Whole ethnic minority communities live on out-of-town estates that former socialist Prime Minister Manuel Valls said contributed to, I quote, a social, ethnic and territorial apartheid in France. Valls also pledged to provide Republican answers to this rampant ill. But of course, he never did. Politicians in France never do. Racist sentiment is extremely hard to monitor or regulate because the so-called colorblind republic doesn't compile data on the subject. France even refuses to acknowledge different identities on the basis that French citizenship is meant to transcend race and religion in this colorblind republic. And this goes back to the Second World War, when official data about people's religion was used to select Jewish people and other victims of the Nazi Holocaust. So there is no official ethnic data monitoring in France, no any proper analysis of discrimination, which is dangerously counterproductive in a nation literally built on immigration, and where it is estimated that 32% of people under 16 have migrant ancestry. Now, with such statistic now banned, France's lofty universalism aims to secure social unity precisely by ignoring differences. Again, the contradiction between fantasy equality and real-world discrimination is startling. Officials, and indeed their numerous supporters in the media, are far more interested in propping up their weak republicanism rather than trying to tackle insidious discrimination. And discrimination really does exist, because as it turns out, your race and your religion actually do matter in France when it comes to being discriminated against. Unofficial sociological surveys have found that 91% of black people are the victims of racism, while minority groups in general are also woefully underrepresented in politics, the media, and other key industries. Minority groups are also 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched. Compulsory identity checks are a colonial law and order tool as well. So this so-called colorblind egalitarianism is a pipe dream. It ignores very real forms of racial and religious discrimination. If you do not have official data about the problem, then it will remain conveniently ignored so as to preserve the status quo. Again, racist sentiment is pretty much impossible to monitor in an official capacity in this so-called colorblind republic. But the National Consultative Commission on Human Rights does at least produce an annual poll that attempts to measure bigotry. The so-called Racism Barometer survey of July 2023 noted that political discourse was marked by an obsession with migration and security themes. Stigmatizing discourse with racist and xenophobic overtone is prevalent in society, according to the report. A particularly serious problem pinpointed by the human rights researchers was the forces of law and order. As early as the 1920s, Paris police had set up a North African brigade to deal with alleged troublemakers imported from the colonies. In this case, the Maghreb countries such as Algeria and Morocco. The unit, which became noted for its extreme aggression, was disbanded, but it was reformed just before the Algerian War and was called the Aggression and Violence Brigade, or BAV. It exists to this day. Those who are obviously from an African and North African background still suffer abominable abuse in France, and Macron's ministers are among the many who now regularly use words such as ensauvagement, turning savage to describe those they still consider to be largely responsible for street crime. So, far from building a cohesive, inclusive society, France's rejection of differences has in fact fostered bigotry, suspicion, and extremism. And this climate of confrontation makes change very difficult, and it adds to the crisis in the social fabric. And in this sense, the Gallic culture, which is envied all over the world, is not designed for people like me. There is a real sense of exclusion, and one that is encapsulated by the out-of-town estates in the suburbs, the banlieue where I grew up. Again, as former socialist Prime Minister put it, social, ethnic, and territorial apartheid exists in France. There are very few opportunities to break out of those housing estates, those neglected housing estates, either physically or indeed metaphorically. If you start poor and disadvantaged, then you'll probably end up poor and disadvantaged. And many of my contemporaries remain stuck on the estates into lives in the periphery. I had to move abroad to further my life chances. So, yes, there is, much inequality and injustice in general, but ethnic and religious minority groups are far more likely to experience this. A consistent way France clamdowns on minority is banning Muslim women from wearing any type of Muslim dress. Headscarves, for example, are said to break strict laws concerned with the separation of church and state. And so athletes covering their heads will not be allowed to represent France at the Olympics this summer, for example. And in this sense, France's obsession with its own brand of secularism, and indeed an often absurd form of feminism, oppresses a huge section of the population. And the great contradiction in French feminist discourse, whether argued by the left or indeed by the right, is that it uses secularism as a tool to allegedly protect and emancipate Muslim women from supposedly repressive males, while also stigmatizing and penalizing those same women. There are plenty of perfectly liberated French Muslim women who choose to wear headscarves and modest clothing, yet they are branded as victims of an oppressive culture and indeed religion. And France thus excludes them and criminalizes female citizens from public spaces because of their clothes, using fines or indeed the threat of prison to enforce its dictats. This weaponization of laïcité, the French version of secularism, certainly belies the country's alleged belief in egalitarianism. France is profoundly misogynistic. The 2023 annual report by the French government's principal equality watchdog revealed that the country, I quote, remains very sexist in all its spheres, and there were calls for, I quote, an emergency plan to combat growing and often lethal violence against women. And so from power players in politics to men in the streets, this sexism crisis shows no sign of abating. I wonder if you want to say a bit about education.
Yes, yeah, I mean, you have time, that would be welcome before we go into a conversation.
So there is, of course, elitism everywhere, and the class system undoubtedly still persists in countries such as Britain. But as someone who has studied and indeed worked here as a foreigner, I can vouch that there is far more egalitarian in Britain than in France. And one only has to look at how diverse the highest echelon of society are. Britain and Scotland have a prime minister from an Asian background, for example, and other ethnic minority ministers in the highest offices of the state are also commonplace. Wales is said to deliver a black minister too. In fact, it is academic performance in France is more strongly linked to social background than in any other OECD country, which stands for Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So despite the Republican motto, disparities prevail. And in class, as later in life, gold standard conformity is always expected as well. Some 99% of candidates for the French baccalaureate the main qualification for university education, pass. So this statistic might sound egalitarian enough, but it in fact renders entry to a first degree course a formality rather than an achievement. And so public universities, for which you pay only a modest fee in France, are like super social engineering farms. Thousands graduate with often worthless first degrees, and only a favoured class gets to the top through elite public institutions, mostly funded by the state because they are from the right background. And this is yet another blatant contradiction of France's supposedly egalitarian ideology. To conclude, the French are not just unhappy about single issues. Many of them, in fact, rage against the entire system. And that too really is what my book is about. A country literally built on revolution and where the turmoil never subsides, because there is, in fact, widespread inequality, clampdowns on freedom, and social divisions that really move us away from any sense of fraternity. The reality is that France's lost grandeur manifests itself domestically in ancient institutions that are no longer fit for purpose. There is corruption, civil strife, and industrial decay, and there's also the very real possibility of a far-right president taking over all power without anything approaching the parliamentary majority. So all this testifies to the crisis and undoubtedly undermines democracy. This sense of downgrading, of déclassement, is also reflected in foreign policy. Just look at the way former African colonies such as Niger and Burkina Faso have been rejecting lingering French influence and exploitation in recent months and years. Populations there are sick and tired of the French keeping military bases while maintaining financial control. They want to be left to run their own affairs. If all of this sounds unnecessarily gloomy, I can assure you that fixing France is by no means a long series of complaints, nor indeed a misery memoir. It is in fact a straightforward read about a modern republic that is failing to live up to its once exalted reputation, while drawing on political, historical, and cultural factors, as well as my personal experience. So the book is ultimately a call for change, and in that sense, it's very positive, and frankly, at times, pretty optimistic. Thus, my suggestions for making France a better country include a shift away from presidential government to a more democratic parliamentary system, and less emphasis on Paris as the only place that matters in France. There should be an end to paramilitary cohorts that resort to colonial law and order tools, such as curfews and obligatory identity checks, policing by consent rather than by brutality. There is also an urgent need for the problems of those on the estates to be recognized so they can be tackled properly. More democratic institutions will also ensure far more effective court convictions and education to fight the normalization of racist discourse, which is openly encouraged by the media. There should be fewer history lessons about ancestors of all French people being the Gauls, as in the Asterix and Obelix, the comic strip, and more taught about France's recent fascist legacy and indeed the savagery of its imperialism. So in brief, in the case of the French Fifth Republic, radical change cannot come soon enough, and I very much hope that you will be fixing France a chance and that you'll enjoy reading it.
Thank you very much.